Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. We're going to be going through a Unit 1 FRQ for AP Comparative Government in Politics. This FRQ is going to be like question 1 on the AP exam, which is the conceptual analysis. And this FRQ, just a brief overrun of it, is very similar to FRQs you've seen in other AP courses like AP Human Geography. They're like the SAQs on the AP Histories. And essentially, these questions are supposed to be pretty bare bone questions where you're given a key term, a key concept. In this case, we're looking at charismatic leadership. You're probably going to have to define or describe the key term, and then you're going to answer some questions about how regimes or governments would apply this key concept. And in this case, we're looking at how authoritarian regimes particularly apply or don't apply charismatic leadership. And you have to use the knowledge from your brain. You're not given any stimuli, no graphs, no history. You're not writing an essay either, so these responses should be pretty quick 1 to 2 sentence responses. And yeah, we're going to look at each of these 4 parts individually. We'll look at how you can answer them, and to kind of further elaborate on them, we're going to look at some examples of how our course countries will apply some of our sample responses to kind of hone that into our brains when discussing charismatic leadership, because you never know, College Board may ask that on the AP exam in some form or whatever. So let's dive right into this with part A. We're simply defining charismatic leadership. And to answer these define questions, you're going to have 2 or 3 of them on your AP exam. You're just going to simply give a 1-sentence definition. And if you know the concept, giving a definition shouldn't be that big of a concern for you. There are multiple ways that we could define charismatic leadership, and you'll see that on the rubrics for the AP exam FRQs, there's not going to usually be one way, one exhaustive way that you have to write a definition, because there may be multiple definitions for a term, or there may be multiple ways that you can describe a term, different examples that you can give. So one really good definition here, this is probably a lot longer than anything you would have written or anything that you would have needed to wrote on the AP exam. So this is a really good definition. Charismatic leadership is a form of leadership where the leader relies on their personal charm and persuasive qualities, magnetism. I don't think anyone would have said magnetism, to inspire devotion, loyalty, or enthusiasm. Or you could have even just said charismatic leadership is where a leader relies on their personal charm or persuasion to earn followers, or to have loyal followers, or to rule governments and create legitimacy. Those are all acceptable definitions here. So some examples of charismatic leadership would have been Queen Elizabeth before she died. She exemplified much charismatic leadership, which is important for the head of state, because that's mainly a ceremonial role. And she had a very long reign, so she built a lot of trust with the people of the United Kingdom. It symbolized stability, unity, as well as tradition. The British monarchy is a major tradition in the country. And she had, a ceremonial role. She didn't do a lot in the field of politics particularly, but she was still the constitutional monarch, even though they don't have a constitution. Mao Zedong's vision for communist China, he was I would say the leader of the Communist Party. I'm sure he had an official title that I can't remember, but he was the head of the Communist Party and kind of transformed China into a communist nation in 1949, using Marxism as the major guiding foundation for China and his personal ideology. And he was able to rally the masses, particularly during the Chinese Revolution and the Cultural Revolution, and that made him a very powerful figure because he expressed charismatic leadership. AMLO, which was the former president of Mexico until 2024, was considered a charismatic leader known for his populist policies, where we know that populist policies try to extend to as many people as possible to try to earn as much votes and as much loyalty as possible. And it was considered that AMLO had a strong connection to the working class. And he was able to speak to the needs and frustrations of the working class, the common people, through rallies and speeches, and that got him a lot of widespread support. Part B, describe how charismatic leadership and policy effectiveness serve as methods of sustaining political legitimacy. And you had to be careful here answering this prompt because it's kind of got too many parts into it. So you can combine them together, which I'm sure most of you did, or you could break it up into do 1 sentence on charismatic leadership and 1 part on policy effectiveness. And that's how I did this rubric here. But that's okay if you didn't separate them. Combining them is perfectly fine as long as you have all the necessary information motivation in your response. So let's look at charismatic leadership specifically. So we could say that charismatic leadership will build legitimacy. You could have put that in your definition, and that would have been fine as well. You could have reiterated it in this part and said that it builds legitimacy. How? By creating a strong emotional connection or some kind of connection between the leader and the population through personal appeal, symbolism. There's other ways that you could have described that. It also inspires trust and loyalty. Trust would have been good for the first part as well, even in the absence of strong institutions or consistent policy outcomes, or really any policy outcomes at all. Sometimes we see a dead government that's not passing any laws or not really doing any change in the country. And for example, Putin has had times where the government hasn't really done a whole lot, but he's had a major strong image in Russia. He's a major figure in Russia. When I think of Russia, I think of Putin. Something else that comes to mind is in China, the NPC, the National People's Congress, only meets for 2 weeks out of the year. So there's certainly 50 other weeks in the year, and they're not doing a whole lot. However, they have the president and they have other major figures in the Communist Party that show that charismatic leadership, that show that the government, it still exists and it's still doing stuff, even if, let's say, the legislative branch isn't enacting policy. They also unify diverse populations. Look at Nigeria, look at Iran. Iran specifically has a majority country, it's majority Muslim. Nigeria is certainly not majority. There's over 200 something ethnic groups there. But we see that charismatic leadership in Nigeria has resulted in a more Christian South, in Islamic North, and then in Iran during the Islamic Revolution, we had Ayatollah Khomeini, I don't even know how to say that. His role in the Islamic Revolution had unified the diverse populations. We see now that Iran is predominantly Muslim. They're under a theocratic rule. So we could see a lot of those characteristics of charismatic leadership here, because Khomeini unified Iran during the Islamic Revolution by appealing to the religious and cultural identities, and that positioned himself as a spiritual leader who opposed Western influence and the Shah's regime, and that led to the regime we see in Iran today. Now let's look at policy effectiveness. Describe how charismatic leadership and policy effectiveness serve as methods of sustaining political legitimacy. Same part, we're just looking at policy effectiveness now. We're going to start with China as our example here. So policy effectiveness would be to sustain legitimacy by demonstrating the government's ability to provide services, maintain order, and foster economic growth. And just something I want to point out here is you don't have to give examples on these parts because they don't ask for examples. So you could just say the first part without giving the example, and that would have been okay. If you want to give an example, that's perfectly fine. It's not going to hurt you. It probably won't help you because examples aren't graded, but certainly the elaboration on the example could certainly a lot. Wow, that can give you a lot of boost on your response here. So we're looking at legitimacy being sustained through policy effectiveness. If the government passes policy that implements services or fosters economic growth or maintains some kind of political or social stability. So for example, in China has the second highest GDP in the world. They've sustained considerable legitimacy through this rapid economic development, the reduction in poverty, the investments in infrastructure and technology, and that demonstrates effective governments under a communist regime, under the Communist Party. We can also see that policy effectiveness will build trust in institutions when policies address citizens' needs. So maybe citizens in particular areas or across the whole country have certain needs or certain issues that they want the government to address. And if the government does address that through policy, then we're going to see political legitimacy being sustained. For example, Mexico has created a variety of different social welfare programs. We see this in the United Kingdom as well. And Mexico particularly, I'm trying to think of one. I think it's Oportunidades. That's a social welfare program that's supposed to provide direct financial support to low-income families. It's supposed to provide access, or improve access, I shall say, to healthcare, education, nutrition as well. And that's strengthened public trust in government policies and government effectiveness. And then we can see that policy effectiveness can enhance stability when effective policies reduce social cleavages. Look at Nigeria. There's hundreds of ethnic groups in Nigeria. There's a lot of social and regional cleavages, a lot of differences between the different ethnic groups in the different regions within Nigeria. So if these policies can enhance that stability, increase that cultural and political cohesion, and undermine and eliminate any type of political unrest, that's certainly going to create some legitimacy for the government by the people. And so we've seen this with Nigeria trying to balance those ethnic and regional interests. I've said earlier that they've really established a more Christian government and culture in the South and a more Muslim culture and government in the North. And that's accomplished through the federal system of government. We've learned that Nigeria has a federal system of government. And that means that power is not just concentrated in the federal government, but it's shared between the central federal government as well as the regional state government. So we see the 36 state governments in Nigeria have their own policies. They have their own bodies that can administer and create and enforce policies. They have their own courts as well. So that provides a lot of stability and balancing for ethnic and regional interests. And that's a commonality we see across federal nations like the United States. We see that in Germany as well, other federal governments, is that they're a lot better at balancing local interests because you have more local and regional based governments that are addressing these issues. In unitary governments like the United Kingdom, they're less likely to address local issues because they don't affect a big majority of the country here. They may not even hear about it, or they may see that it's not that important compared to other problems in the rest of the country. All right, let's do part C. Explain why authoritarian regimes may seek charismatic leadership. Well, we just discussed in the last part that it can sustain political legitimacy. And so you could write about that and you could say sustain political legitimacy, but you also got to elaborate and say why that is important and why sustaining political legitimacy is important for the government and political stability and just the maintaining of the government. So there's a lot you would have to write with that, but there's some other things we could have written for this part. So you could have said that it centralizes power. Charismatic leadership allows for an authoritarian regime to consolidate power around a single figure. For example, Putin in Russia. I can't name anyone else in government in Russia, and that's an honest thing. And besides Putin, because they have centralized their charisma and their government around Putin. He's the single figure, the ceremonial figure of Russia. And that can minimize internal competition as well as internal dissent, which is something that we see authoritarian regimes like to do, is they want to limit that opposition. I'm also thinking of Russia. They really don't like opposition in the government. That's why they've eliminated those regional, the gubernatorial elections for the governors. So, for example, Putin, oh my gosh, that's what I put for my example, has built an image as a decisive and patriotic leader. And of course, we know that Putin suppresses opposition and keeps rival political factions weak. And that can provide them greater access to power or sustaining power in the long run. And so that's why authoritarian regimes, we got to cater this response to authoritarian regimes. And that's what I'm doing here, because we know that authoritarian regimes oppose dissent and they want to maintain power as long as possible. They don't have free, fair, competitive elections and so on. The next response would be when government institutions are inefficient or corrupt, a charismatic leader can serve as a unifying symbol, and that can distract from systemic failures, not replace or fix any of these failures, but distract them. And we see that in Russia as well. We also see that in Iran, where Ayatollah Khamenei, I think I said it right that time, he had religious authority and personal influence in Iran that helped maintain legitimacy, even when the government faced criticism for economic mismanagement and political repression. So we see those two problems there, but we saw that their charisma kind of distracted them. We saw that he exercised control over key institutions like the military and judiciary through his religious authority. He used religious symbolism and anti-Western rhetoric to unite the citizens, especially against external enemies. And it has also limited political competition by disqualifying candidates through the Guardian Council, and that ensures that this ideological conformity and stability is passed on to the future as well as future leaders. We'd also see that authoritarian regimes may seek charismatic leadership for some kind of emotional connection between the people and the leader, and that can foster loyalty and trust, even if there's no democratic institutions in place. And for example, Xi Jinping in China, the president, has cultivated an image of strength and visionary leadership through nationalist rhetoric, quote-unquote anti-corruption campaigns. We also have touched on the economic growth, and that's secured widespread support despite the lack of any political pluralism in the Republic of China. We saw recently that Xi Jinping got rid of his term limits. It used to be 10 years as per the Constitution, but in 2018, he amended the Constitution, so now he can serve until he dies, and that can reinforce his long-term leadership. We also see that, of course, these anti-corruption campaigns provide some kind of illusion that they are eliminating any corrupt people. They call them rivals to the Communist Party, and that gains public support. The nationalist policies present himself as a protector of China's global standing, and of course, the Chinese people as well. Another response, they could say that charismatic leadership will justify any repression. That's another one that's really catering to the authoritarian aspect of this question here. So a charismatic leader can frame crackdowns on dissent as a necessary measure to protect stability and unity. Putin's a great example of this. He'll use his image as a protector of national interests to justifying suppressing political opposition, particularly in the media. We'd also see that they would put in charismatic leadership to enhance national identity. We just kind of touched on this with China. Charismatic leaders will position themselves as embodiments of national values, cultural pride. They'll promote patriotism as well. In Iran, Khamenei portrays himself as a defender of Islam, which is what majority of the citizens of Iran practice. He said that he defended Islamic principles and ideologies and Iranian sovereignty, and that reinforced his role as both a religious and political leader when he was the supreme leader of Iran, I think until 1989. Part D, explain how authoritarian regimes may undermine legitimacy provided by charismatic leadership. Okay, so we know that authoritarian regimes, they can provide legitimacy through charismatic leadership, but how can they revoke this legitimacy? How can they exploit it and possibly get rid of this legitimacy that they create here? So when legitimacy is tied too closely to a single leader, the regime's stability becomes very vulnerable. And if the leader loses popularity or leaves power, or let's say they die, who's going to lead? And they may not have someone selected or someone that the people agree upon to be the leader. And that can undermine the legitimacy that they've built up for the government in that country. So for example, when Putin leaves, whether that be the next term or whether, probably not, but whenever he dies, whenever Putin does leave, that does raise questions about the future stability, about the political system of Russia. There's not very a clear successor in place right now for his position. The absence of institutional stability will mean that any leadership change could trigger political turmoil or violence. Long-term reliance on a personal appeal, on a personal leader, can make it difficult for the regime to maintain legitimacy without him. Charismatic leadership can lose its appeal if the government fails to address economic issues, corruption, or social unrest. Let's say there's a big social event. Let's say there's a big corruption scandal, or there's economic downfall within the country. Even if you have charismatic leadership, it can lose its appeal if the government doesn't address these issues or fix these problems. So in Iran, Khamenei's authority has been weakened by public dissatisfaction with the economic hardships and political oppression that the country faced during his time as supreme leader. We saw that these economic hardships were caused by sanctions that the governments placed themselves and other forms of government mismanagement. That intensified the public dissatisfaction. There were anti-government protests that heightened a weakened bond between the citizens and the leadership. And younger generations today in Iran are increasingly critical of the regime's strict religious policies and any lack of reforms or change within the country. You've seen a lot more Western influence in Iran, which is something that Khamenei was very against after the Islamic Revolution when he was supreme leader. Widespread crackdowns on dissent and lack of political freedoms can erode the connection people feel to a leader. People want to have freedom. People want to be able to speak their minds. People want to criticize the governments. When you have countries that don't allow that, people will see that as a human rights issue, and they're not going to see legitimacy or feel or have legitimacy for the charismatic leader. So, for example, in China, Xi Jinping has heavy censorship and treatment of minority groups and the media. That's another good example as well. Minority groups like the Tibetans and the Uyghurs, and that sparked international and domestic criticism, so both within the country and outside the country, and that's undermined his legitimacy. There's been scrutiny over human rights abuses for these groups, suppression in Hong Kong, and that's damaged China's global and domestic reputation. Domestic criticism grows with the censorship and surveillance. There's been a lot more of that in China recently, especially because the younger populations are more tech savvy, and concentration of power around Xi Jinping has limited government adaptability, and that's risked instability if his popularity will wane and decrease over time, especially with new generations coming into China and becoming more politically active and becoming very tech savvy. Moving on, I think we got 2 more responses left. Efforts to promote a leader's image through propaganda can backfire, and that can lead to skepticism or resentment in the people for the leader. In Russia, there's state-controlled media, and that's glorified Putin. It's not really calling out any issues or any concerns from the people, and that's faced pushback from younger, more critical populations. We see loss of trust. That kind of relates to that as well. We see scandals, corruption, especially in authoritarian regimes, any type of perceived hypocrisy, and that can damage the credibility of a leader's persona. We saw election protests in Iran a few years ago, and that actually resulted in the internet being shut down for 6 days, and that certainly led to loss of trust for the government and a decline in legitimacy. In Iran, we see accusations of elite corruption, economic mismanagement now and in the past that's fueled protests and other mistrusts for the regime, and that's weakened the standing of any supreme leader, any president or leader within Iran as well. All the examples I just made related to Khamenei, because just to keep it. So what are some commonly confused concepts that we discussed here? Charismatic leadership, it's based on personal appeal and vision. It's based off charisma. It's as simple as that. Traditional leadership comes from political customs and traditions, such as the monarchy in the UK or the supreme leader's religious authority in Iran. Legitimacy is about the public's acceptance of a government's right to rule. However, we also talk about a concept called political stability, and that's the absence of major conflict or any upheaval within a country. We see that more in heterogeneous countries like Nigeria that have a lot of different ethnic groups, have a lot of different political parties, with a lot of different beliefs and ideologies present within the country, all under the same government. And a regime can be stable without being legitimate. We can have stable authoritarian regimes. We can have legitimate authoritarian regimes, but and vice versa can also occur. Effective policies can enhance legitimacy because it sees that the government's getting stuff done, especially if they're addressing the needs of the people. But legitimacy depends on factors like ideology. Does the government believe what I believe? As well as tradition. Are they maintaining tradition, or are they trying to change tradition without people's say? As well as leadership style. Are they leading the country in a way that's going to lead to prosperity? It's going to be anti-corrupt and so on. Even if there are successful policies or just policies passing in general, it doesn't always secure acceptance of a regime. China's economic success and GDP growth under different market reforms and neoliberalism has boosted prosperity as well as legitimacy, but they still rely on censorship and repression. So we see a lot of different ways that authoritarian regimes try to create and generate this political legitimacy, but that doesn't always guarantee acceptance because sometimes that does backfire. Thanks so much for watching. Please like and subscribe. It's free, which means it costs $0, and it really does help me out. Leave a comment down below with any questions. I'll be happy to answer them. There's some links down below in the description with practice tests, key terms, guided notes, all that fun stuff. Head on over to the next AP Comparative video on some really cool political stuff.